I've spent 37, almost 38 years on this earth, and all this time I thought I had a pretty good understanding of who I was. This part of my journey, learning about myself as a leader, has yet again taken my blanket of comfort and tossed it onto the ground. How did I get here? What are the key elements of me? How does this impact me as a leader, and how does it affect others under my leadership? These are questions that have popped up during this time of discovery, but this time, instead of me feeling raw and vulnerable, I accept the beauty in this hot mess. This hot mess was created for a purpose. On August 25th, 1978, I was born into the world to two people who were just children themselves. My mom had just graduated from high school and my dad was just a sophomore in college. They married right before my birth and stayed together for a few short years. My parents divorced when I was 2. Although they didn't make it, I was never short on family. Both of my parents came from large families. My mom's biological siblings were 13 and count, and my dad had 11 siblings on his side of the family. I was raised around large family gatherings, in quite the collectivist spirit, so having lots of people of varying backgrounds around me was consistently the norm. Not only having people around me, but people who looked just like me were around. Clearly, there were no prejudices about African Americans, in my eyes, but all the while, they were subconsciously forming, affecting the way I saw the world. Thanks to my large family setting, I was also quite accustomed to hard work. While I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, I was also far from living in poverty. My grandfathers were both hard-working men. My paternal grandfather owned his own construction company, and my maternal grandfather was one of the top workers at DuPont Chemical Company. Both of my grandmothers enjoyed careers as housewives. This gave them plenty of time to nurture me as a child. My mom was also dedicated to work as she held down 2, sometimes 3 jobs while attending school part-time and keeping her first job as a mother priority. Yet again, I saw the world as limitless, no color lines, nothing to hold me back. As a third-generation college student, school was never presented as an alternative to anything. It was my only option, and it was an unspoken option at that. I don't recall there ever being any deep conversations about what I would do once I graduated from high school. It was just expected that I would naturally matriculate into college, so moving on to Baylor University after graduation was a logical step. So life looks pretty good, seemed pretty great, but underneath it all, what if life had followed the path that is assumed of a child from a single-parent household? What if I had not had the loving family around me to be my village? What would be my assumptions about the world around me? While these were great questions to ask, they still didn't uncover the truth that was buried inside of me. While at Baylor, I lost 2 of the most important people in my life, my maternal grandfather and my Aunt Jean. They both believed in discipline with love and respect, and she, as a teacher, believed in the power of play. Subconsciously, they were both preparing me to become a teacher. When I reflect on my journey as an educator, I see large chunks of them in me. One might say that they both served as the introduction to critical theory for me. Both my grandfather and my aunt were well respected in their communities and worked to help others achieve the same. But digging deeper, I see that they were the foundation for me to speak up for social justice. I just didn't know it yet. I've always been aware that I was African American. Every day looking in the mirror, I saw a girl with brown skin. I was tall. I got that naturally from my 5'10" mother and my 6'5" father. But the most outstanding feature for me was my skin. But growing up, I didn't feel or understand the power of my melanin. I didn't understand that the power of my cultural capital came along with being African American. When I look back at my schooling, it's easy to see why that happened. I was placed in the talented and gifted program in the 2nd grade. The majority of the class was white, with approximately 3 blacks in the mix. Once we merged into the upper level schools, the classes were still largely white, while the number of black kids tripled from 3 to 9. Maybe even 12 if we're being generous. I never felt any inequities in the classroom. Looking back and reflecting on my experience, I would probably question the placement more. Why was I asked to join the class? Why weren't there more people who looked like me? What assumptions were made about me as a child that garnered me membership into this elite order? In some people's eyes, the black students in TAG were akin to the character Go Lightly from Derek Bell's book Faces at the Bottom of the Well. To other African Americans, we were looked upon as sellouts in the academic setting, simply because we utilized the Queen's English, took more challenging courses, and were involved in the arts rather than sports. This continued on into other areas of life, as I was often the only black girl in most of the activities that I enjoyed doing. Color was lacking, but it never mattered to me, or so I thought. Again, I was raised to do anything and everything that I desired, so I never allowed my skin color to be a barrier. That turned out to be a lie. What is most interesting to me is that the 2 people who were the most influential to me, who encouraged me the most, were on the lighter end of the spectrum of color for African Americans. In fact, my grandfather was so light-skinned and had such fair hair that most people thought he was white. I carried some of this with me to Baylor, as the first 2 years of my time there I didn't hang out with many black students. I blamed it on being in the band. What a cop-out. On one hand, I was slightly intimidated to be out of my bubble. Scarily, on the other hand, I was unconsciously exhibiting a prejudice against anyone who wasn't like me. But how could that be? Black people couldn't be prejudiced against anything, right? It wasn't about color. I saw anyone who was raised with the same odds as me and wasn't making positive moves in their lives as lazy, full of excuses. I failed to understand that while they looked the same on paper, they were lacking things in their village that I possessed that allowed me to rise above. I also began to realize that while I had these advantages, they could and would be overlooked by many who would only see my skin color and not the value of my cultural capital. When I began teaching, I started to see how my unintentional prejudices were woven into my schema. My first teaching assignment was in my hometown. Most of the students at my school were African American, so immediately I assumed that students would listen to me because we looked the same. Not. Why? I wasn't prepared to serve children who, while they looked like me on the surface, had little to nothing in common with me. My first class was composed of students who were children of high school dropouts. Many of the parents were very familiar with the local law enforcement, and a large majority of them were absent in the school setting. So sadly, my expectations quickly mirrored their participation. As Trumbull notes, teachers' expectations can lead students to feel as though they do or don't belong in the classroom, affecting their engagement in learning and consequently their achievement. I'm sure eventually their cultural capital had to take a blow. I also had to learn to connect with parents. Here I was, a young, single black female, no kids, recently graduated from an expensive private university, used to being the only black girl in the settings around her, now thrust into a pool where everyone looked the same. Many parents resented me and my ideas or suggestions about their children. They remarked that I talked white and thought I was better than them. I had to learn how to make the switch between my school and street vernacular, to make connections with the parents. I never spoke teacher talk with them, and I worked on breaking things down and asking for their input. As a new teacher, I didn't understand the power of my voice. I didn't see that I needed to be the number one advocate for my cultural capital, and in turn advocate for students of color as well. It's a challenge that I've taken on with great fervor. With this growth, I had to decrease me greatly to make deeper connections with those around me. I had to abandon my prejudices and assumptions to make way for fresh lenses through which I could see my students and their true value. As our society continues to change, our school culture remains much like it was decades ago. We have to start asking, can there be equity for all children in education? Do our prejudices about some races keep us from exploring the potential of some students? Do the racial inequities of our staff contribute to a lack of social justice and concern? A frightening irony exists in the study of philosophies that are supposed to have shaped our education system. It is my assertion that our present education system, or the one I grew up in, hasn't listened. We have to erase the deficit thinking that is plaguing our schools about race relations in our country, and start asking questions like, why is the cultural capital of some groups still not valued? Why do we still acknowledge an achievement gap that is based on white cultural standards? In asking these questions, we will start to understand the treasures that our students bring into the classroom, and we can change the cultural capital of our learning environments. So the purpose of this hot mess? To have a major impact on education and race relations. How? My upbringing is definitely infused in my classroom, as the first thing I seek to do every year is establish a classroom community built on trust, respect, hard work, encouragement, self-efficacy, and love. No matter who you are or what your background, these characteristics can be attained. I believe the purpose of education is to build lifelong learners who advocate for themselves and others, to build strong communities and people. I believe that my role in the field of education is to be the facilitator for those opportunities for students to explore themselves and the world around them. By being open, caring, compassionate, and a listening ear, I am the leader that my students and my school can count on. I value collaboration, authenticity, rigor, and relevancy, and hope that as a leader, others see that and want to be part of that movement too.